Please give a warm Georgia Tech welcome to our guest, Carl Nordgren.
Thanks. Appreciate it. Thank you very much. Thank you all, and thanks for coming out. Is this on? Yep. Before we get started, I guess I have a couple things to say. One is I realized I had to tell this story. My grandfather, who I called Pappy, from Greenville, Mississippi, I grew up with understanding that the deepest disappointment in this man's life was that he applied to Georgia Tech and didn't get accepted. And so he applied to no other college because he was so heartbroken by the fact that you all wouldn't let him in. He went on to be an electrical contractor and lived a happy life, but all the time I would hear stories about how the one thing he wanted to accomplish in his life was to come to school here. So I grew up thinking, this must be just the most special place where the most privileged people get to go to school. And so when I got invited to come speak here, I felt quite honored. And so thank you all very much for coming out to hear this talk. Although I guess for many of you it's required, right? It's your course, so I won't get, or your class rather, I won't get too carried away. I'm here with some really good news. And it might be really great news. And the longer I live with this news, the more confident I become that it's really important news, vitally important news for you all. And I look forward to sharing it with you. But first, I want to get to know you all a little bit better first. Raise your hand if you're an undergraduate. So that's by far and away the most of it. You all, graduate student, raise your hand. Oh, wow, a bunch of graduate students. And then others? We met. Another one over here, wonderful. Raise your hand if you are an entrepreneur or wannabe. Okay? Now let's exercise your imagination a little bit. You're going to graduate soon, many of you, or you're already out of school. Here's what I want you to imagine, that there's a group of friends, maybe some family, who are planning a big party for you, celebrating your graduation, celebrating a birthday. Maybe you've just gotten a big client for your company, so they're planning this party to celebrate who you are. And in the course of getting together to plan this party, they're talking about you, and they're starting to identify certain attributes that you've got because they want to try to capture who you are in this party. Maybe it's going to be a themed party. So spend a moment thinking about who these friends would be, and spend a moment imagining how they see you, how they would categorize you, how they would describe you to each other. All right? Now raise your hand if creativity, being creative, is one of the things that they say about you. Raise your hand if it's one of the two or three things they say about you, if it's sort of a defining characteristic of you. Okay? I just want to have a sense of who the audience is. I like to see myself as a storyteller, and as a storyteller, I always want to have an appreciation for the audience, right? So I know what story to deliver. Well, so this really good news, this great news that I have for you is rooted in a misconception that we've had in Western culture for at least generations and centuries, I think. And that's the misconception that creativity is a gift delivered to a privileged few of us. That's how we've seen creativity, as I say, for centuries. The word inspiration sort of suggests some of that, right? The word inspiration suggests that my creative idea is a gift from the gods. I'm inspired. The Spirit comes within me. And only a few of us had that gift. I'm here to tell you that that's just flat out wrong. Creativity is a basic human quality. It's as common as dirt, and all the more wonderful because of how common it is. I mean, when you're 4 and 5 years old, you are so imaginative. You're so curious. Basic qualities of a creative person are you curious about the world? Do you have a vibrant imagination? And we all had that. That's how we learned. Right? We all had those qualities when we were in 3 and 4 and 5 and 7, and maybe we started to lose them a little bit when we were 9, and we started to lose it a little bit when we were 12. But we have those basic qualities. To be creative is a basic human quality. We also like to shape our environment to create advantage for ourselves or for each other. That's a creative activity. That's a creative activity. So my proposition to you is that that sense that we've had that creativity is this rare, rare gift that only a few people have is just flat out wrong. And so what I want to talk to you about today is that I sense that there's a revolutionary movement building as more and more people become aware of the fact that being creatively entrepreneurial, and in just a minute or two I will talk to you about why I link those two words and why I always link those two words together, creative and entrepreneur, to be creatively entrepreneurial. There's a revolutionary movement that's building predicated on the idea that each of us and all of us need to be creatively entrepreneurial, and I sense this revolution is gaining in its momentum, and I'm here to tell you about the nature of that revolution, and I'm here to share with you some of the content that we've created in my classes at Duke designed to help you become more creatively entrepreneurial and be a full participant in this revolution. So let me just tell you why I link those two words together, creative and entrepreneurial. If I say creativity all by itself, most of us, most of the time, see that as artistry, right? As artists are creative. They paint wonderful pictures, they compose great pieces of music. That's what most of us, most of the time, think of when we hear the word creativity. And certainly when we hear the word entrepreneur, most of us contemplate that classic startup entrepreneur. Well, my proposition is that creativity is way too important to be left to the artists. Entrepreneurship is way too important to be left to the entrepreneurs, that we need to, each and every one of us, become more creatively entrepreneurial. And that by linking those two words together, maybe I give you the opportunity to think sort of fresh about those two words, try them on from a different perspective, and see that maybe we can draw a larger circle that allows more of us inside. I'm told time and again in my classes at Duke that one of the best things I do for my students is just simply give them permission to see themselves as creatively entrepreneurial, to see themselves as creative and entrepreneurial when they haven't allowed themselves to see themselves in that fashion. So here's what I think about this creatively entrepreneurial revolution. I consider it to be a creative populist revolution, and I take the word populism very, very seriously. I believe this creatively populist revolution is three things. It's necessary, it's logical, and I don't know that revolutions are often logical, but I think this one's logical. It's necessary, it's logical, and it's not just optimistic, it's wildly optimistic, and I'll tell you why. It's necessary because my proposition to you all is that the economy hasn't recovered because it can't recover. It can only be renewed. It can only be rebuilt. And that will only happen when waves of creatively entrepreneurial talent come washing over all of our organizations, all of our institutions. And oh, by the way, a great part of that wave is going to be the millennial generation. I believe the millennial generation is the first great creative generation. Tell Georgia Tech to invite me back and I'll talk to you about why I think you're the first great creative generation. So the revolution is necessary because we need the renewal that will come with this revolution. This revolution is logical, and the logic was applied, and the momentum for this revolution is going to grow because this logic has been applied by IBM about 18 months ago. As I described the study, I would be interested to see a show of hands as to who's heard of this study. About 18 months ago, spring of 2010, IBM conducted the kind of research that IBM is going to conduct. They interviewed 1,500 CEOs, 30 industries, 60 countries, and they asked these CEOs, what's the employee quality that you value more than any other in today's work environment? And the number one answer was creativity. Who knew about that study? Who knew about that study? So isn't it logical that you should be preparing yourself to be who these CEOs want to hire, right? I would bet that every one of us in this room would love to sit across the table from one of those CEOs in a recruiting conversation, and you now know that the number one quality that they're looking for is a creative individual. And if you read that research, they're very, very clear as to why. Before I get to the why, They're also very clear about where they need creativity in the organization, and it's everywhere. They need it in the CXO office, they need it in middle management, they need it in frontline positions. And they're recognizing that it's time now to tear down the walls of this little creative ghetto that they used to allow marketing and product development, right? There have always been creative people over there. It's time to tear that wall down and have creativity flow across all the functional areas. The CEOs are saying this, not me, the CEOs are saying this. So the revolution is necessary, it is logical, and it's wildly optimistic, and here's why it's wildly optimistic. It believes in its inevitability, so that's got to be optimistic to believe that it's inevitable that you'll be successful. But let me share a couple of reasons specifically why the revolution is so optimistic. Back in the 60s, when the space race, the space age, we thought that was going to be forevermore part of the American culture, and when NASA was this cultural significance back in the 60s, they appreciated that there was a particular sort of creative thinking that was really important in their recruitment of engineers and scientists, and it was the quality of creative thinking that's referred to as divergent thinking. Divergent thinking is that process where when you have a question that you're trying to answer, how many answers do you generate? Because the idea is that creativity is a numbers game. The more solutions, potential solutions you come up with, the more likely you're going to find the best one. So for their engineers, their scientists, NASA recognized it was important that they would be really good at divergent thinking, that they could come up with multiple solutions to a problem, multiple applications for a tool, right? So it doesn't describe the entire creative process, but it's a really important piece of the creative process. So some researchers found out that NASA had this assessment tool to measure people's ability to engage in divergent thinking. The researchers grabbed a hold of this tool, made it age-specific for 5-year-olds, applied it to 1,000 5-year-old kids, 98% scored at a genius level at divergent thinking. 98% scored at a genius level at divergent thinking. Now, the creative populist revolution says, so what? When we learned that when they were 13, only 27% of them scored at a genius level, and when they were 25, only 3% of them scored at a genius level. We say so what to that because that was a while back when we were not as appreciative of how important it is to cultivate the creative qualities of each other as we are today. So there's one reason to be optimistic. It's inherent in us. I'm trying to make the point with you in a couple different ways that we are creative beings. We just have to claim it. The other reason why the revolution is optimistic is because I don't want to pretend to be anything other than an interested and maybe semi-educated layman on this topic, but I love reading what the neuroscientists are learning about, for instance, how incredibly plastic our brains are. Most neuroscientists think that that's like one of the defining characteristics of our brain, is that it just seems to be so prepared, so ready, like yearning to change based on how your mind wants to use it. When I was your age, we were told that your brain is the best it's ever going to be when you're 20 years old, so be careful what you eat, drink, or smoke, because you might accelerate the deterioration, but that's all you got left is deterioration. We now know that that's not true. What fires together, wires together. If our minds apply our brains towards particular cognitive processes, those cognitive processes will change the shape of our brain. And so if you exercise your creative abilities, you will grow your creative abilities. See your brain as much more like a muscle than perhaps you had ever seen it before. So that's sort of the nature of the revolution. It's necessary, it is logical, if you accept that premise for the logic of it, and it's wildly optimistic. As I've worked in my classes over the years, developing content to help prepare students to be more creatively entrepreneurial, initially as I was working on this content, and I recognized, well, what a wonderful sort of test kitchen, right, that I get to play with content, hear how students respond to it, adapt based on how they respond to it, continually improve the content. That's what I thought I was doing initially, was sort of testing my ideas. What I've come to understand was that while it sort of felt like that, that wasn't what was going on at all. What was really going on was that what we were doing, the students and I together, is we were sort of revealing common ground. we were coming to understand that there were certain concepts, certain principles about being creative, about enhancing and developing your creative abilities that would be consistent with Samuel Johnson, the 17th century English literary figure, who had an aphorism that was, man doesn't need to be informed as much as he needs to be reminded. And because I take the populist aspect of this stuff so seriously, I like content that you already know. That as I share it with you, you'll be nodding your head saying, well, yeah, I guess I knew that. I guess I knew that. So that's what we've done here, I think, is found some common ground where we can all start together in the journey of developing our creatively entrepreneurial talents. You know, creativity can be as common as dirt, but it's unique to each one of you. Each one of you has your own creatively entrepreneurial personality, and so I see this common ground as nothing more than a starting point for you to develop your own template of content that serves you, cultivates you, develops your creatively entrepreneurial talent. So this content that we've developed at Duke in my classes has got 3 core components to it. I have a creatively entrepreneurial attitude, right? We all have control over our attitude, so that's a populist proposition, that attitude is a avenue towards being more creative. And I also like the fact that so often, again, we think about creativity as magical. And I've had moments where I've felt like it was magical, but it's delightful to know that it's the exercise of my will that gets me to that magical place. I don't have to wait again to be inspired. So there's a creatively entrepreneurial attitude. There's a creatively entrepreneurial technology. It's always nice to have a technology that's extending my reach, leveraging my work. If it's going to be a populist, it's got to be a populist technology. It has to be available to everybody. And there's a creatively entrepreneurial science to study. So here's what they are. The creatively entrepreneurial attitude is intentionality. All the great faiths have known that it was important for pilgrims, for novices, to declare their intention, because they know that in that moment of declaring your intention, you change. You begin to see the world differently in that instant. And so much of creativity, of course, is perspective. It's about how you view what's going on outside and around you. So in that instant of declaration, of being intentional and saying intentionally to yourself, it begins to be part of the internal conversation that you're having about who you are. It becomes part of the conversation you're having with your friends and family around you, that you are a creatively entrepreneurial person. In that instant that you declare that intentionally, your view of the world begins to change. Along with that intention, that little declaration, we offer some behaviors to practice. Right? Behavior, the word behavior means how I present myself, and the hand is part of that early definition of the word behavior. You know, it's sort of presenting yourself in your hand to the world, so it's behaviors or how you act, how you present yourself throughout the course of the day. We've identified 4 creatively entrepreneurial behaviors. I'm going to ask you to pick which one of these 4 you would like me to tell you a little bit more about because of time restrictions. So the 4 creatively entrepreneurial behaviors are being generous, being humble, being playful, and being enthusiastic in your search for beauty. Raise your hand if you want to hear me talk about an example of how being generous serves you as a creatively entrepreneurial person. That looks like a decent number. How about humility, being humble? Wow, that looks like maybe 1 or 2 more, so being humble wins so far. How about being playful? Wow, you guys want to be playful. That's kind of ironic, and I think maybe we should choose playful. How about enthusiastically searching for beauty? So it looks like it's being playful, and maybe I can hit on a couple of the others. Why it's sort of ironic to pick being playful is because all the research suggests that your generation, your millennial generation, is the least playful generation ever. Your parents loved you so much that they never gave you any spare time, right? You came home from school, and there was a schedule there for you, right, of more classes, teams, all kinds of activities, right? You had less opportunity to engage in open-ended play than our generation did. It's not that we were enlightened. We had no choice. We had all this time to fill, and with our human quality imagination, we filled it with open-ended play. And here's the beauty of open-ended play, ladies and gentlemen. The beauty of open-ended play is that it's not just taking a couple of sticks and a tarp and making a fort. It's that pretty soon after that, you're bored with that, right? So you take the stick and the tarp, and the stick becomes your telescope, and your tarp becomes your cape, and you see the new world through the telescope, and you have to populate that world with your imagination. It's the continuous reimagining. It's not having imagined, it's the continuous reimagining. And when you think about something like, right, all you management students, what's hotter and forevermore will be hotter than continuous improvement? Doesn't that feel like sort of continuously imagining what should be coming next? The other thing that's nice about being playful as a creatively entrepreneurial attitude is, who wants to stop playing? Right? Don't you want to keep on playing? And so when you're working on a creative process, trying to generate ideas, engaged in divergent thinking about all the options that could solve this particular problem, you're not going to stop with the first one when you're playing. When you're having fun, you're going to keep working your way through and finding more solutions and more options. Another reason that being playful is such a wonderful attitude to practice is that, again, you'll see the world differently. You don't go through life most of the time feeling playful, but if you can conjure that up in yourself, if you can, in fact, adopt that as a point of view, the world around you looks different when you're being playful. It gives you another fresh perspective on the world. So there's places to discipline yourself intentionally, to take on that intentional attitude and discipline yourself in these ranges of particular behaviors. Other places to practice intentionality is in the language that you use. Right? Of course, we understand how our thoughts shape our words, but let's be a little bit more mindful about how our words shape our subsequent thinking. And of course, not just our thinking, but the thinking of the people around us who hear the words that we choose. I learned this lesson. It might be, in retrospect, I guess maybe the first business lesson I learned was the importance of language, because it did occur in the first job that I had as a fishing guide. Last 2 summers of high school, first 2 summers of college is when I was up in Canada as a fishing guide. And in fact, that first summer I wasn't a guide. That first summer I went up to be a camp laborer to sort of apprentice my way towards being a guide. And the first day or two that I was there, this occurred. And so I'm 15 years old. I'm at this wonderful fishing camp, fishing lodge. And the camp owner, and this is an amazing place. This is a place where John Wayne used to go before I got there. Folks with gray hair like me will be impressed that I got to meet Natalie Wood, the actress, when I was there. Ernest Hemingway's son was there. I mean, it was an amazing, amazing operation. And so the camp owner, Barney, is having a conversation with the camp foreman, Dutch, about the fact that this great dock that crosses the bay is no longer of sufficient size for the size of the camp. And so they're going to build a new dock around the point. And they've been planning on building this new dock around the point since the previous summer. Now the plans are all in place. They're fine-tuning the plans. All the boats are out for the day for fishing. Those of us who are in the camp for the day are going to start working on this dock. And as Dutch is starting to walk away with me as his work crew, Dutch stops and turns to Barney and says, well, you know, after all, Barney, the devil's in the details. And Barney said it with such passion and such certainty that I was just riveted at the moment and just thought, wow. He said, no, Dutch, we're running this place with the idea that God is in the details. And I spent the summer trying to figure out what he meant by that. I knew he meant something. It was important to him. And of course, I kind of got what he meant. But what I fully understood that he meant as I spent the full summer with him is that I got to observe a man who was generous in the inches and the minutes, who was humble in the inches and the minutes, who was always going to over-deliver to his guests. I can't help but see guests with a capital G when I say it, when I talk about Barney's camp, because every place guests was written in that camp, it was with a capital G. And so this camp created such a rich, rich environment, not because of just big, bold things that the camp did, but because every detail was attended to with, you can use a capital G or a small g for this God if you'd like, but with a God is in the details, attendance to the details. And so I suggest to my students that if you're part of a creative collaborative team, and especially if you haven't known each other very well before and maybe you're working together for the first time, that if you spent just a couple of minutes talking about what's the difference between us taking this project on with the devil is in the details work attitude or a God is in the details work attitude, how might the project feel differently, be attended to differently? A place where the language that you use can make a difference. Here's another place. Raise your hand if you like being taken advantage of. No, you came close. Okay. So why do we say we don't like being taken advantage of, right? It's an unpleasant thing to contemplate. So why, when an opportunity comes along, do we say we're going to take advantage of that opportunity? Now, please listen, because there's some. This is on the line, right? To say you're going to take advantage of an opportunity doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to take the best and leave the rest for you. It doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to distort what's going on here so that I see it better and new and fresh and you see it differently. It doesn't necessarily mean those kinds of behaviors, but that's what you would call that. If I were to take the best and leave the rest, you would say I'm taking advantage. What if instead we said, when an opportunity comes along, that we're going to create advantage from this opportunity? Once again, it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to nurture it, that I'm going to cultivate it, that I'm going to invest in it, that I'm going to bring the best folks I know and we're going to surround it and we're going to make sure that this is sustainable and beautiful and healthy growth. It doesn't necessarily mean that kind of behavior, but doesn't it point you in that direction? And so once again, when that creative collaborative team comes together, if you decide not to talk about the difference between God is in the detail and devil's in the details, maybe you want to talk about the difference between how we would take advantage of this opportunity or how we would create advantage from this opportunity. And as I share this stuff with my students, maybe one of the best examples of how language can make a difference came from a student. He raised his hand in the back and he said, okay, Nordgren, if I buy into what you're saying about the economy needs to be renewed, and it will only be renewed with a lot of creatively entrepreneurial talent, if I buy into all that, then shouldn't we stop calling ourselves a developed nation? Right? That's one of the sort of binary categorization we do of countries. There's the developed countries and then there's the developing countries. He said, I don't want to call us a developed country. Who wants to be where we are right now, man? We want to be a developing country. We want to know that the best is coming. We want to be so dynamic and with so many wonderful initiatives emerging that we want to see ourselves as a developing country, call ourselves that, so we see ourselves that, so we act that way, so it's more likely that, in fact, we will become that. I said hallelujah, and he got an A+. So there's another place to practice intentionality. Here's one more place to practice intentionality, and we'll move on to the creatively entrepreneurial technology. And that is, I urge you to be intentionally sensual. And in my classes, I often get a little bit of giggles right there because, of course, in the Western culture, and certainly in America, we so often conflate sexual with sensual, right? But they're really very different realms. You can have a full conversation about being sensual without ever addressing sexuality. And so intentionally being sensual means to take the moment and feel the surface, right? Just feel the surface. Or take a moment when you're stroking the dog's fur and realize how the texture of it changes from the front of his torso to the back of his torso and how his body sort of responds to it, right? Take in these senses, develop your sensual perceptions, because that's what creativity is, of course, is how you perceive the world. And if you improve all of the receptors that you've got, then possibly you develop this thing that folks will often refer to as your sixth sense, which means this wonderfully orchestrated combination of all of the senses that you've got. There's an intuitive aspect to that. There's a very highly creative aspect to being a more sensual person. I mean, who doesn't want to live a life that has greater sensual appreciation to it? So there's the creatively entrepreneurial attitude of intentionality. The creatively entrepreneurial technology is story. And I have no problem seeing story as a technology. Hopefully I'll be able to recruit you to the point of view that story is technology. It was 50,000 years ago that we developed the capacity for language. In fact, I think it was 50,000 years ago, 2 weeks ago, I think was the anniversary of the development of language. God, old people laugh at that. Young people don't laugh at that. I think that's funny. It's roughly between 50 and 75,000 years ago that we developed language. I like to think of language, I think it's easy to think of language as the first open source software. And if, in fact, you want to see language as the first open source software, story was the first killer app. Absolutely. Right before we developed the capacity for language, I mean, like right before we developed the capacity for language, our technology up until that point was disposable technology. We call it disposable technology because we did so little to it, our tools, that there was no point in carrying them around with us. We just disposed them after we used them. We took a stone and chipped a little piece off the stone. We took a stick and sharpened it a little bit. It's easier to do that again than it is to carry that stuff around with you. So all of our technologies before language were disposable technologies. Immediately after language, historically speaking, immediately after language, we have nets, we have baskets, we have shelter, we have much more sophisticated clothing. So here's where story served us so very, very well. Imagine the status quo mindset of a prehistoric person trying to figure out, you're describing, building a basket, and the rudimentary baskets that we would have created. Why would we want to do that? Why do we even want to do that, right? That's work, that's challenging. And again, why would the status quo be any easier to overcome back then than it is today? And so what story did was not only encode the directions on how to build that basket, but provided the story as to why, the utility story as to why, the value of doing this, why you want to invest yourself in mastering this craft could also be captured in story. And when we realized that story could carry that purpose for us, not only deliver specific information that's valuable to me, but put it in the context that makes me really understand the value that I'm going to get from it, well, then we all became storytellers. It was the first populist technology. Then we learned, as we became that much more comfortable in our primitive worlds, that we started to contemplate, why are we here and what's this world all about? And we started creating stories about human aspiration, about what humans are becoming. Those stories were stories, right? The images, the models of what the highest levels of human aspiration that we could imagine would be were captured in our stories. So what that means is that for 50,000 years, I told you about the plasticity of our brains. For 50,000 years, our brains have been shaped by us being storytellers. For 50,000 years, our brains are storytelling machines. We're really adept at delivering story, and we've got to hear information as story. Story is such an insistent technology that if you give me some information without providing me with the context, I'm going to make up a story myself. So, because our brains are these storytelling machines, that creative collaborative team that you're getting together with, if you suggest to them that whether we're starting a company, or we're creating a marketing program, or we're developing a new product for a customer cluster, that if we contemplate this as the story that we're creating, then the creative capacity of everybody around that table is most likely to be tapped into most effectively, most quickly, most immediately, most universally. So I could talk about story for hours, and this is where Samuel Johnson's quote really kicks in. I could talk about story for 2 hours, and you guys would say to yourself, well, I knew that. I knew that about story, to make the point that you know a lot about story, that you are storytelling machines. Well, here's one thing that story really serves me, really helps me with, is when I contemplate story, it makes me think of an audience for the story, right? There's lots of times we're thinking about a customer as a customer is absolutely the right thing to do. If you're doing a lifetime analysis of the value of that customer, if you're doing some administrative work, you want to think about them as customers. My proposition is that you will more likely get the customers that you want, both quantity and quality, if you first treat them as an audience. So what a storyteller knows about an audience is that there's no point in telling the story unless you have the audience's attention. And when I was a young marketing guy, I could occasionally convince the bosses to give me twice the budget that they wanted to give me with, if I could prove to them that, man, I would use that money so wisely to buy an audience's attention. You won't find many bosses these days that are going to give you twice the budget that you'd like to have. So I think that the most effective way for you to attract an audience's attention is to be attractive. But the best way to be attractive isn't for me to tell the audience my story, but for me to tell the audience your story. Nothing is going to be more interesting to you than a story about something that's really important to you, some aspiration that you have that defines who you are, if I tell you a story about that, you want to hear that story. You're going to work just as hard as I'm working for us to be in relationship together. If there's somebody here that wants to go to NYU Law School, and I start telling you a story about how to get into NYU Law School, and I walk down the stairs and start to walk out the room, all of you who want to go to NYU Law School are going to get up and walk with me, right? You're going to work hard to participate in that story because it's your story. And so when I'm approaching a market, when I'm approaching an audience, 5 more minutes? Okay. Then I know I want to tell them their story. I want to insert the DNA of my value proposition. I want to look upon that story as the delivery vehicle for me to encode with the DNA of my value proposition so that I'm promising that I'm going to help you achieve your great aspiration, that I'm going to help complete your story, but it's all related to your story. So again, I could talk about story for a while, but we want to make sure that there's time for Q&A here. So the third node here in this content is the creatively entrepreneurial science. It's a very new science. You know the word, you may not know it's a science. It's about 25-year-old science. It's the science of complexity. Who knows complexity as a science? Have you been introduced to complexity as a science? It doesn't mean complicated, right? We often use complexity when we mean complicated. Complexity was a science that came about when scientists from many different scientific perspectives, physics, chemistry, econ, were some of the leaders that got into this first, realized that from their various professional perspectives, they were increasingly interested in the same thing, which is to not know more and more about less and less, but to begin to understand why from so little do such amazing things occur. Why in a universe of entropy, where all these powerful forces are saying neutralize, neutralize, drain the energy, rust, deteriorate, why in the force of that universal force, in fact, does life occur? Do things grow? Do things evolve? And so it's the study of the forces that cause creativity to occur. Creativity in the most basic sense, creation to occur. And here's a couple things about, and so you know some of the concepts that get captured in creativity. Emergence, right? You can't go to an entrepreneurial or a creative conference and be there for very long without hearing the word emergence time and time again. Things are emerging in this, this complexity studies how things emerge, how things become. The CEOs who say that they need creativity say they need creativity because they understand that their business environments have become so complex that the only way to navigate that complexity is with a creative mind. So emergence is a concept of complexity. Increasing returns is a concept of complexity. And so the idea of complexity, and I urge you to study it. My study is fairly recent. My immersion in it is lifelong, because the most complex system of all, of course, is the natural world. And if you've spent time hiking, hunting, living in the natural world, you're surrounded by the forces of complexity all the time. And when I was a fishing guide, most of the guides were Ojibwe Indian. In the United States, we're more used to calling them Chippewa Indians. And I was introduced, I don't remember why, I was introduced to their word for wisdom. Their word for wisdom is Minogue, M-I-N-O-G-I. And as I got to know, I'm an old enough dude that I was up there in the 60s. And in the 60s, there was still a large clan of Ojibwe Indians who had never lived on a reserve before. So they were sort of Amish analogs. I mean, they weren't clearly living the life of their ancestors, but they hadn't adopted modern ways either. And so that population, when you plug into that population, they will tell you what Minogue means is something more than wisdom. That what Minogue means is, and this would be the wisdom when all of our ancestors were in our aboriginal states, what wisdom would have been more important than the cognitive ability to understand the patterns of nature? And patterns, in fact, is right? All the patterns of nature and how they interrelate with each other and how cyclical they are and how they're constantly changing and constantly in flux. Understanding the patterns of nature, especially the patterns that promise abundance and opportunity, and then learning to live your life in accordance with those patterns of nature. That's what Minogue means. That's a subconscious knowledge that we had because we were actually pre-conscious at the time that would have all been so very important for us to know how to do that. And so now that knowledge, that capacity, that cognitive capacity now resides in our subconscious mind. And so the complexity is the study of the forces that are seen as bottoms up self-organizing, how independent but interrelated units with a bottoms-up self-organizing simple set of rules will continue to emerge, form relationships between each other. Those relationships change the nature of what was before, and it continues, and it continues. Emergence means that which we see at the macro level transcends the micro pieces that created this new emergence. And so that's creativity, right? That's the creative process. And so I tell my students all the time that when you're setting off on a creative project, you want to have a sense of how complexity is going to influence this, because you certainly don't want to fight against those rules, right? You want to use that force in your favor. You want to use that to work with you. And so my thinking about this is that if you study complexity as a science, or if you live it by spending time in the natural world, that either of those activities will help tune your subconscious capacity for seeing patterns, for managing patterns, for learning how to deal with the nuances of ambiguity that occur in these emerging systems. And I sort of cap that with another quote from another old European white guy, German named Goethe, who has a quote that says, "Thinking is better than knowing, but not as good as looking." When I introduce that quote with my students, I usually stop there halfway through. I said, "Thinking is better than knowing." And man, oh man, oh man, Duke students don't like that at all. They don't like at all the idea that thinking is better than knowing, right? They want to know. How do you get an A on your test unless you know, right? Well, the aspect of emergence suggests that what you know is really only useful to the extent that it helps you think about what's going on here. Because again, it's emerging, it's constantly changing. What it was yesterday isn't what it is today. So what do I know? What I know is continually in flux, so the way I'm thinking about it is going to provide the greatest service and benefit to me, and my thinking about it will improve dramatically if I spend some time looking at it, just looking at it. One of the things that complexity has done for me is it urges me, influences me to change all of my verbs to active tense verbs, right? If everything's emerging, I want to be emerging, I want to be active tense, because otherwise I'm being left behind. So one of the examples of this is that I never again am ever going to talk about somebody being recruited, right? Businesses will recruit you, and then as soon as you're hired, they stop recruiting you. And if you're really of talent, the business has made a mistake because they're now the only person who isn't recruiting you. The rest of the companies are still recruiting you. I want to be continually recruiting. I need to be continually recruiting because I need to, because what we're going to do tomorrow is different than what we were doing yesterday. Another place where it changes my thinking into a more active tense thinking is I used to be really good at planning marketing campaigns. Now I want to do market campaigning. Right? A market campaign begins and it ends, but what happens after it ends? Right? Market campaigning means I'm continually engaged in nurturing, nudging, pushing my objectives along. So I want to always be finding places to try to make my verbs active tense verbs to stay with this emergent quality. So real quick, last piece, and then we'll get into Q&A. So I show you this template of content that's got 3 nodes to it: creatively entrepreneurial attitude of intentionality, technology as story, complexity as science. That's all designed to help you emerge as a more creatively entrepreneurial person, to help you emerge as a more creatively entrepreneurial person. But then a time is going to come where you're going to have to do something creatively entrepreneurial. So we also offer one application of your creatively entrepreneurial abilities. I've kind of mentioned some of it, but I'm going to change the language on it. I talked about divergent thinking, and the 98% of us when we were 5 years old were genius at divergent thinking. I really don't want to call it divergent thinking. I want to call it divergent discovery. I think calling it divergent discovery helps me think about the thinking that I need to do better than more than calling it divergent thinking helps me realize that it's about the discovery process. So divergent thinking, again, is the top of the funnel, right? Just getting as many ideas as I possibly can get my arms around as I'm trying to solve this particular problem. The second half of the application is and again, traditionally it's called convergent thinking. I like alliteration. I like improving the language. I call that, so it's divergent discovery and then convergent creation. I find these best ideas that I've got. I start to play with them. I engage in kaleidoscopic thinking. I probably don't need to say too much to you about what kaleidoscopic thinking would be, right? I keep changing the dial. I keep changing the relationship between these things that I've identified to find new relationships between them, just like I find something new every time I turn the dial on a kaleidoscope. And I keep working with these, and I begin to distill the essence of the very best ideas, and I converge to my solution. So a last quick story about converging to a solution, and then we'll get into Q&A. How much are we good? Okay. So here's the story, and this will take just a couple of minutes. I was 4, 5, 6 years ago. I was driving home early one morning, and I was driving down a country road, 2-lane road, and it was low, swampy forests on either side of me, low, swampy woods on either side of me. I looked up the road, and I could see two shapes walking across the road with a very distinctive locomotion. I was a little confused by the way they were crossing the road, and they were small. So I pulled the truck off the side of the road, and it was couldn't have been more than 2 or 3 day old baby snapping turtles. As I picked them up, one of them disappeared totally inside her shell, totally disappeared inside her shell. The other one stuck his neck out as far as it would go, opened up his mouth as wide as it could go, and threatened me, right? Perfect little miniature menace there. So I put him in my truck. It's a really unpleasant sight to see a 30-pound snapping turtle, killed on the side of the road. So I put him in my truck, drove to a place where I knew there was a path that would take me about a mile down the path to a creek, so they'd be well off the highway. And as I got to the creek, I put them down in the water, just right next to the shore, right in the water, and in an instant they both disappeared. In an instant they were both gone. One of them burrowed into the soft mud. The other one darted as fast as it could into the deep water. And I just thought that was the coolest thing I'd ever seen. Regardless of what the predator was, one of them would have escaped. And there was such beauty in that. And so here's where I'm going to apply this now to convergent creation. And that is that as you're bringing all these wonderful ideas that you've been playing with your playful attitude, that you've been playing with, as you're bringing them into the solution for your problem, what's going to happen more than once is that ideas that you really like are going to be in conflict with each other, right? An idea that you really thought was really cool and an idea that your partner thinks is really cool are going to be in conflict with each other. And what's our inclination? Our inclination is to compromise. My experience in this creative process is that so very, very often a compromise means you wind up with something less than. Let's think about both, right? When you're trying to find the answer, let's think about both. Reimagine the question that you're asking. Reimagine the strategy that you're considering so that both can be the answer, right? Both of these strategies were impressive, effective, necessary. So what question do I need to ask to make sure that both of these diametrically opposed behaviors are still both the right answer? So that's the divergent discovery, convergent creation, the application for this wonderfully creatively entrepreneurial person that you're in the process of becoming as you join the creative populist revolution. So, time for questions. Oh, well, thank you.
Hey, this is Francis Larissa. I'm a business student here in the College of Management. Thank you for coming and sharing your time with us. My question relates actually
So
to...
say your name again, I'm sorry.
Francis.
Francis? Okay.
Yeah. My question actually relates to a concept developed by Dr. Barry Schwartz. The idea is called paradox of choice. The idea is that kind of in society and business and individually, we're surrounded with sort of a multitude of choices of like decisions that we can make. And we're almost sort of paralyzed by the idea
Yeah.
that we can't make a decision. And I kind of wanted to see how you related your idea of having complexity being a good thing, and how you sort of balance that between becoming paralyzed, not being able to make, action-oriented steps in business or whatnot.
Well, I mean, that's just a great question to start this off with, because I don't know that I got just the right, precise answer for you. But this concept of choice, in fact, my first draft for my talk today, I was going to hit choice right at the top, and I was going to hit choice in exactly the way that you're hitting it, right? I mean, in one of my classes, we are studying the evolution of technology. And in that study of the evolution of technology, progress becomes part of the conversation, right? One way to measure if the significance of the evolution of technology is it creating progress? And so in the class discussion about that, we used choice as one of the key measures of progress, right? Just a couple, 3 generations ago, you had no choice about who you married, where you worked, where you went to school. Those were all decided for you. Well, now we make those, we decide who we're going to marry 5 times in a lifetime, right? And we've got a lot of choice now. And so generally we have the sense that choice is this marvelous freedom. But when I was part of a mobile communications company that was introducing voicemail for the first time, the company that I was consulting with that introduced voicemail created a grid of all the different options. How long would the voicemail message be? How long would it stick? Just like there were 5 or 6 different options, and they created this extraordinary grid that finally gave the consumer about 40 different choices of what voicemail product they wanted to have, and they couldn't figure out why they couldn't sell any of those products. And it was because, man, I have a 39 out of 40 chance that I'm going to make the wrong decision. So indeed, you're right. Many times where compressing choice down to just a few, good, better, best, right? That's certainly served the test of time, is the more appropriate way to offer up choice. I haven't looked at choice specifically through the lens of complexity. That's my best riff on choice. If you've got something to add to that indeed engages some of your sense of complexity, I get smarter because I hear smart students say smart things. So lay it on me. No? I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I mean, although I guess I did.
Great thing, but also something that's pretty, I think, paralyzing as well.
Very scary.
So I don't know. That's kind of where I am right now, and that's why I brought it up.
Well, I could add a little bit more then to that. That's not on the question of complexity, but on that on how you've bracketed this as you as a student contemplating your future. You're not going to make a wrong choice. I mean, you're just not. There's been many times in my life where I've thought, well, what am I doing here? Why am I here? Why have I made this choice? Why is this the right place to me? This doesn't feel like the right place to me, only to discover a year, 3, 5, 7 years later, wow, my experiences in that place have really enriched what it is I'm trying to do now. So that's my best shot. All right, great, thanks.
Hi, my name is Ben. I'm a grad student in mechanical engineering focusing on design theory. So one of the things you talked
Focusing on
design theory.
Design theory.
One of the things that we struggle with in this field is the idea of creativity, because as of yet, there's no really objective quantification for it.
Right.
And the argument from the founders of the field and various experts is that if we can't measure it, if we can't quantify it, how can we know whether we're improving it or not?
Right.
And I'm just curious in your thoughts on the matter.
My thought on that is that I tend to, I mean, that's one of the core questions about this whole idea of us all embracing creativity and growing our creativity is how are we going to measure it? How are we going to tell if we're making progress? I heard a really good answer just a couple of weeks ago. Anybody here know Sir Kenneth Robinson? You know that his work? he's one of my heroes, and I got to meet him a couple of weeks ago. And so he was asked this exact question, and he said, well, the assessment shouldn't be creativity in the abstract. The assessment needs to be creativity applied to what particular, to a particular purpose. And we can assess the value of, the effectiveness of, the utility of creativity when it's applied to a particular purpose. You can assess whether a piece of music, one piece of music is better than another piece of music. Yes, it's a subjective measure, but there's generally some confirmation, right, from others around you. There is some sense that this is a quality piece and this is a less quality piece. These are the shoes that are going to last forever, and these are the shoes that are going to be less comfortable. Right? So assessing the creative input when it's directed towards a particular output is not all that difficult to do. It's not all that difficult to do. We do that all the time. We may not be conscious that we're specifically considering the creative input, but we're certainly assessing the creativity's impact on the output that we're going to acquire. It's the challenge. I mean, it's the challenge to teaching creativity is how do I assess it, right? So I try to be just as transparent as I can be with my students. I acknowledge that my evaluation is going to be highly subjective. Let's get that out right away. So then I say I'm going to be as transparent with my prejudices as I can possibly be. I'm going to be prejudiced in favor of big, bold risk. Whether you pull it off or not, I'm going to be prejudiced in favor of big, bold risk. That's going to be one of my prejudices. But my view is that I have enough intimate relationship with these students over the course of, I guess maybe I shouldn't use that word these days. I have enough close relationship with my students over the course of the semester and enough evaluative points that in the aggregate I feel like I can measure two things. I can measure progress, and I can finally make a measurement that sort of stands on its own as to where they are as a creative individual as they walk out the door. So again, great question. Assessment is a challenge. And this conference that I attended 2 weeks ago was on innovation in education. A lot of really smart educators there all wrung their hands and said, yeah, you're absolutely right. We don't really have a classic assessment tool. There is the Torrance test. Anybody know the Torrance test? The Torrance test began about 35 years ago where they evaluate. They've got many different exercises that they'll take 6- and 7-year-old kids through. And they've done it now for like 400,000 kids over a 25-year period of time. And it's even longer than that, I guess, since the 60s. I keep forgetting that the 60s aren't 25 years ago anymore, are they? They're 40 years ago. So again, that's a really very large database of kids who have taken the Torrance test. And you probably know about the Flynn effect. You know that with each generation, IQs are getting higher and higher and higher. And initially, that was also true of Torrance scores. They were getting higher and higher and higher. One of the reasons why I'm so passionate and have a sense of urgency about the importance of this revolution is that for the last 10 years or so, Torrance tests have actually been slipping. The creativity of kids has actually diminished a little bit in the last 10 years or so. So there's that assessment. But again, that's of a specific longitudinal study.
Hi, my name is Nicholas Seitz. I'm a fourth-year business administration major. I guess as future business leaders and managers, can you give us a couple key recommendations on how we can create a working environment that fosters creativity?
Yeah, and that same conference I attended a couple weeks ago, I'd like to think that this was my language, but I'm stealing this. It's not command and control, it's climate control. It's to create the environment. It's to create the environment around you that causes other people to want to step up. So there's one thing. I mean, I'd never wanted to be a director. I wanted to be an initiator that allowed space for others to complete our understanding of what it is that we're trying to do, right? They're going to enjoy doing the work a whole lot more if they've had some opportunity to shape what the work is supposed to be, as opposed to me dictating the task. And so that was one thing that I practiced as a CEO of these startups. Another was that I would say to these folks, enthusiasm is really important. Nothing great is ever accomplished without enthusiasm. It's going to be my job. It's going to be my job for you to maintain your enthusiasm. You got all this hard work you're going to do, and you're going to get disappointed, and you're going to be frustrated. And it's going to be hard for you to maintain your enthusiasm. My job as a leader, that's maybe my singular job as a leader, was to help you maintain your enthusiasm. Another bit of advice, I think I might have seen this when I was looking at your curricula. Is there a course here on servant leadership? Boy, you got to understand servant leadership, man. You got to understand servant leadership. He who would, she who would lead should first be a servant to the organization, to be genuinely and authentically committed to improving the quality of the people around you, to show that you really care genuinely about them not only getting their work accomplished, but learning and growing and developing their qualities and their talents as they're getting this work accomplished. To have that point of view is to now have a group of people who are going to invest so much trust in you that you'll find that when you're moving less from the servant and more towards the leadership part of that equation, you're going to find a group of people who are quite prepared to be prejudiced in favor of what your proposition is, what your idea is. So was that the answer to your, I mean, that's basically it? Okay, good, thanks.
Thank you very much for your time.
Well, thank you. Thank you.